Good morning. My name is Julienne Daniel, and I am an environmental health specialist for the Arkansas Department of Health. And today I'm going to be talking about vaccinations and the vaccinations specific to the children of Little Rock, Arkansas. And I'm going to be addressing the concerns that you, the moms of Little Rock, presented to me at the health department. I hope to clarify the questions that you guys have about vaccination damage and to create a dialogue between us, the health department, and you guys as parents to facilitate the best outcome for the children of Little Rock. Before we begin, I wanted to give an outline of today's discussion and hopefully use this outline to answer your questions that you have about vaccines. First, I want to talk about the history of vaccines, specifically in the United States, and then narrow in on Arkansas's history with vaccinations, and show where does Arkansas fit in the timeline of vaccination acceptance and promotion. Then I will talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of receiving vaccinations, and these advantages and disadvantages are specific to children since that is our concern for today's discussion. Then address the concern you guys have about potential vaccine damage in children and talk about what are the risks that are prevalent in the literature, but also what are the myths about vaccines that need to be clarified. Finally, talk about the vaccination requirements and exemptions. Does your child's school require vaccinations? And which ones are required? And if you're looking to receive an exemption, how do you go about getting one? And which exemptions are acceptable in Arkansas, but also how do they vary among states? The history of vaccinations goes back to as early as 1000 AD, when the Chinese were using inoculation techniques to respond to an outbreak of smallpox. Interestingly, the United States also started promoting vaccinations in response to an outbreak of smallpox in 1721. Now, even though the United States as a whole was promoting vaccinations, the first state to promote the use of vaccinations was Massachusetts in 1801. Arkansas followed in 1882, passing a state law mandating vaccinations in school children, and states continuously followed after that as well. Now, the article on the left talks about Death the Vaccinator, and that was used as a topic and key point for the Anti-Vaccination Society of America. Now, they were founded in 1879, and they were completely against the idea of vaccinations, and they wanted to abolish the idea of compulsory vaccination. Now, compulsory vaccination simply means that the vaccination is required by law, and they thought that the efficacy of vaccination as a disease preventative was a matter of individual opinion. Now, though there was opposition as well as favor for vaccinations in regards to federal government, the Supreme Court commonly and most oftenly supported the idea of vaccinations and herd immunity. And the most denoted Supreme Court case that I think really encompasses this idea is Jacobson v. Massachusetts, where it was the idea that they were against vaccinations. However, though, at the end, the Supreme Court sided with implementing mandatory child vaccinations as a condition for public school attendance. And that made it a requirement to have vaccinations to attend public schooling, and that was soon followed by multiple states, Arkansas included, and we'll go into more detail about the Arkansas history for vaccinations in a moment. Before we dive into the history of vaccines in Arkansas, I wanted to take the time to clarify a fairly recent topic in the media that has shifted public opinion about vaccinations. In 1998, a man by the name of Andrew Wakefield released a study stating that there was a causal relationship between the MMR vaccine and the development of autism. Now, this was a huge statement, and it created a very big response from parents and guardians of children with autism. It also created an anti-vaccination movement, worried about the safety of vaccines and that they were not foolproof and they could cause secondary illnesses. But in 2003, a reporter named Brian Deere investigated the validity of the study and started to accuse Wakefield of falsifying medical histories of children in order to basically concoct this picturesque study that he was hoping to use as a way to sue vaccine manufacturers and to create a vaccine scare. And that was all for the money. Well, this followed with 10 of his 12 co-authors retracting the entire study, stating that there was no causal link between the vaccine and the autism because the data was insufficient. So you can see the picture on the bottom is actually a screenshot that I took of the paper, and you can still look at it today. You can click the link below to actually go to the paper, and it says retracted across in red. And that is because this study is no longer valid, and it is no longer used in scientific discussion or anything like that, and it is noted that it was no longer deemed scientifically accurate. And Wakefield was stripped of his medical license because of this in 2011. But there is still a distaste for vaccinations because of this idea. And I wanted to reassure you moms of Little Rock that this relationship that you might have heard of is insufficient and not scientifically based. And I really hope that that brings some clarification and relief, because I know that this has been a prevalent debate in our media and public opinion. And so I hope that this brings some. Now that we have talked about the history of vaccines in the United States and clarified a key debate and topic in the recent years, let's dive into where Arkansas fits into this timeline in the vaccine movement and promotion. As I talked about before, the Jacobson v. Massachusetts court case sided with the vaccine requirements over the personal decision of not vaccinating, and the same is true for Arkansas. Auten v. the School Board of Little Rock in 1907 regarded a child who refused to present required vaccination certificates to enter into a school. In the end, the court sided with the state and did not allow the city board to allow the child into the school. They even cited Jacobson in their reasoning, stating that the Little Rock's vaccination regulation was not unreasonable where smallpox was prevalent in the city, and the school board acted under the orders of the City Board of Health and physicians' advice. Moving forward in time, World War I frightened many citizens and created concerns about the spread of smallpox. So, the Arkansas State Board of Health instituted a school vaccination rule. The rule required students, teachers, and employees to certify either their receipt of the smallpox vaccination or their immunity to the disease before entering public or private school. Now, this is important because up until this point, regulations have been applied to public schooling. So by including private school, the state is demonstrating that vaccinations are not just a public school issue and should be applied to all school systems. Now, as of 2016, children are required to have the certifications of certain vaccinations, and these include diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis A and B, influenza type B, chickenpox, etc. Let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of vaccinations. Now, there is a full list of pros and cons to receiving vaccines, but I have just referenced a few here due to the time constraints. Let's go ahead and start with the advantages. The first advantage to your child having vaccinations is that it can save your child's life. The reason for this is very straightforward. If your child receives the vaccine for a disease, it protects, lowers, and/or eliminates your child's chance of getting the disease. For example, let's say your child gets the MMR vaccine that we just talked about previously. Your child is now protected against measles, mumps, and rubella, all of which can be deadly if untreated. Another example is if your child receives the annual flu vaccine. It protects your child from exposure to the flu, which we see commonly in schools. And if your child is in a school system during the winter months, flu is very prominent. And so receiving the flu vaccine could protect your child from being exposed and being diagnosed with the flu. Vaccines can protect future generations. Your child is a future generation, so by getting vaccines, your child is protected from many diseases that could have already taken his or her life early on. Protecting the future generations ensures the health of your children, their children, and so on. Finally, adverse reactions to vaccines are extremely rare. This is true. The probability for adverse reactions with vaccines is rare. Now, we'll go into more detail about some adverse reactions, but regardless, the likelihood is very, very rare, and a lot of times the reaction is not causally linked to the vaccine. Now, with advantages, there are also disadvantages. Like we just talked about, vaccines can cause serious and sometimes fatal side effects. However, these are extremely rare. The risk of not vaccinating highly exceeds the risk of rare side effects. The article, Vaccine Adverse Effects Separating Myth from Reality, talks about an Amish community that has very low vaccination numbers. And in 2012, a pertussis outbreak resulted in roughly 48,000 cases and 20 pertussis-related deaths. All of these instances could have been avoided if they were to be given the pertussis vaccine early on. Finally, another disadvantage is that diseases that vaccines target have essentially disappeared. Now, this is not because the diseases do not exist, it is because the vaccines are working and are eliminating diseases that are deadly and fatal. So when you hear a vaccine and you think, what disease is that? I've never even heard of it, and I don't know anybody that has ever had it. It is not because it doesn't exist. It is due to the fact that vaccines are working and that they are protecting you as well as your family and your friends against the disease prevalence. To go off of that point about the prevalence of diseases and vaccine effectiveness, I wanted to show this figure because I believe that it highly demonstrates what I'm trying to tell you guys, which is that vaccines are able to lower and even eliminate some diseases completely in regards to cases reported. So below shows a figure of the pre-vaccine era annual reports of cases and then the most recent annual reports of cases as of 2010. And you can see that for some diseases, there is a complete elimination of the disease altogether. But regardless, all are declined in their prevalence in reports. So I think it's important to note the dramatic difference between the two, and I believe it shows how effective vaccines are in lowering the prevalence of disease and for some eliminating them completely, like diphtheria and polio. Even though we discussed the probability of having an adverse event is extremely rare, I provided this slide to discuss the statistical evidence of adverse events and how to address these in a productive way. As mothers, I understand that you want all the information out there, and so I wanted to take the time to provide some adverse events that have been documented. All in all, the CDC recommends that your child receives 29 doses of 9 vaccines before the age of 6. And in the journal article, Deaths Following Vaccinations, What Does the Evidence Show?, a group summarized historical information and published data on the deaths following vaccination. They concluded that the mass majority of deaths were coincidental and not causally related to vaccination. Common reactions and allergens like pain and swelling can occur at the reaction site. Systemic reactions including fever, irritability, drowsiness, and rash may also occur. These are common but could also indicate your child's allergy to a component of the vaccine and should be monitored when given said vaccination. Finally, fainting after injection can happen. There is evidence to suggest that there is a causal relationship between injection and fainting, but this can apply to any medical procedure involving a needle stick and does not singly due to vaccines. With fainting, there is a likelihood of head trauma and death due to head injury. Fainting is common within the first 15 minutes following an injection, so to have your child observed in that interval of time would be best advised for your child's safety. Though the article discussed some adverse events, they concluded that making general assumptions and conclusions about vaccinations causing death based off of just spontaneous reports is not a scientifically valid practice. What are the vaccine requirements for Arkansas? Well, the Arkansas Department of Health decided that for K through 12th graders, except if they have an exemption, the child is not allowed to be admitted into a public or private school unless they have certain vaccinations for certain things that are listed above. And they have to be given as evidence either by a licensed physician or a public health department acknowledging the immunization. So what are the vaccine exemptions for Arkansas? Below you can see a figure showing the vaccines exemptions for schools, and Arkansas is labeled blue for medical and personal belief exemptions. For personal belief exemptions, those can be labeled as either philosophical or religious, and both can be used under that section. In order to receive an exemption, you have to submit an application that signs a statement saying you understand the exemption, you have completed the educational component supported and developed by the Department of Health, you have signed a consent to refuse to vaccinate, but you have also signed a statement understanding that if there is to be an outbreak in your child's school, that your child will be removed. Now, this application has to be resubmitted every year, and so every year you have to continuously apply for your exemption in order for it to continue across multiple years in school.